Welcome to the introductory presentation on Australia and the 20th Century Poetry Unit, and what we'll be looking at is how you can frame what Australia's dream might be for a particular group of people, or how a particular group of people might grow to understand it, and what poets have thought that dream has meant. So, for example, the dream might be one about being a courageous and powerful young man who was able to make his mark on the world, but that dream is only available to a certain group of young men and certainly not available to women or Australia's Indigenous population, for example. On the front page of this presentation, I've actually got a poem that was written by Lunig, and it is a satirical representation of the very famous Dorothea Mackellar poem, I Love a Sunburnt Country. In it, and you might like to pause and read it, he looks at the broad cross-section of people, not only people from an urban environment, from the wealthy to the working class, but he also acknowledges Australia's Indigenous inhabitants, as well as the RSL Anzac tradition, the people who are, environmentalists, the greenies, for example, and he tries to give us a broad brushstroke of the complex nature of Australia, and that we're not perhaps the English settlers that are first represented in Dorothea Mackellar's poems and poems that predate her poem. In fact, what we learn when we delve into poetry of the 20th century and even this century is that poets tried to shed light on the fact that the dream has not been available to everyone, or that dream of what it means to be Australian has broadened because of the changing nature of our culture and our identity. I'm going to show you a short clip based on Australian film and its industry and the sorts of stories it tells. You might like to pause and reflect after you've watched it to see that Australian film identifies a certain type of hero. You might recognise references to Ned Kelly, but there are other criminals referenced, including Chopper Read. You'll also note that there's some award-winning films, snippets from award-winning films, but there is a theme that exists within these stories, and it talks about finding your place and being able to tell your story. And what 20th century poets have tried to do is to exactly show that there are other stories beyond what is identified as a broad brush dream. I'll just play on now.
Everything knows its place in the scheme of things. Everything sits in the order somewhere. You've got to decide. You've got to work out where you fit.
Since the very beginning, the way we've learned about who we are and where we've come from is through the stories we've told.
Welcome to Australia.
Hello. Hello, my countrymen.
From one generation to the next, we've passed down our history, beliefs, and a few jokes.
Do you have the Texas Chainsaw Mascara?
By simply telling each other how it was.
Coming close.
Or how we think it should be.
That's not a knife.
These days, the storytellers are still telling stories.
There's nothing wrong with dreams.
Tell him he's dreaming.
Stories of who we are.
Look at me. Look at me. Look at me. Look at me.
And who we might be.
There is no hiding. You cannot hide. You have to give your best.
Here we go then.
Let's shake this world.
stories in the world. They entertain us. They inspire us. And they help fuel our economy. We think that's a story worth telling.
I like it.
Some of those iconic films, some of which are aimed at children, really celebrate this idea of the underdog, the unlikely creature, confronting the most impossible, scenarios and then being victorious. And if we look into Australia's history and what frames the dream of being a young colonialised nation, we might identify in the poetry and the figures who become quite famous this belief that regardless of the odds, despite the laws that govern us, the most unlikely people can rise up and be successful. And if you are looking at poetry in the 20th century, it has its foundations, these stories that are grounded in early colonial times. So what I thought would be useful, because you're going to have to define what a dream is for a select group, is to consider where did Australia formulate this idea of being a nation of a fair go, being a nation that celebrates ingenuity and courage and bravery, being a nation that thinks that the law should be on the side of the little people, that being a nation that encourages people to believe that anyone can make it. They can own their plot of land, live happily in the suburbs, and be equal amongst his and her neighbours. So if we look at the background and the 1800s, we find in poetry a particular focus in literature which regales us of tales of life in the outback. And certainly in those tales are tales of lawlessness. In this picture in particular, we have The Last Stand of Ned Kelly, and Ned Kelly is our most famous bushranger, made iconic not only because of his helmet, but his desperation in his last stand facing up against the police. Now, as a nation being able to celebrate this man is not because he committed atrocities and crimes so much, but it is the fact that he stood up to authority. He faced impossible odds. He tried to rise out of desperation and poverty to have some control over his life. Those are the qualities that seem to underpin a dream that 20th century poets want to explore. Similarly, we have the event of the Eureka Stockade, our first example of a type of civil war where miners in the gold rushes stood up against the mining tax. And this is actually a student video, so apologies for the errors, but it actually pictorially captures very effectively the Eureka Stockade. So you have these insurgents facing almost impossible odds, a battle 1 against 2 at best. And what we learned from the miners was this preparedness to put their life on the line so that there was fair and equitable ruling. They weren't prepared to pay the enormous taxes simply to work the gold fields. These weren't impressive environment. It wasn't an impressive environment to live in, and for people living in the gold rushes, which attracted a lot of poverty-stricken young men looking for fame and fortune, the increased charges and the inability to, mine successfully really stifled their lifestyle and their ability to succeed. So they fought for taxes that were raised for the reason of alienating those poverty-stricken people. So you get a sense of, whenever you read writing about the Eureka Stockade, this firm belief in fair rights for the working class man. And these help to shape what becomes part of the dream, that young men ready to make a new life for them should have a fair go at being able to attain that. And what's interesting in that little video is the complete absence of references to Australia's Chinese population, who came in quite significant numbers during that period, but are often silenced. So when you're starting to think about this dream, start to think about who's included in that dream, who was recorded as part of Australia's history, and who was alienated. And you'll also note with interest that there are no references to women and Australia's Indigenous population. So what starts to become the most publicly acceptable part of the dream is the dream of the hero. It is usually a man. He's usually living on his own, and he is the swagman, the stockman, and he is out fighting the elements, often on his own, bit of a lone cowboy, bit of a frontier man. And this scene is a very famous scene from The Man from Snowy River, and we know The Man from Snowy River is a story by Banjo Patterson celebrating the very famous stockman who was able to tame the wild brumby when no other man could herd the brumbies, and especially the significant, special and most desirable brumby of the pack. In this scene, we have the Man from Snowy River going on an impossible ride and being victorious.